Hi, welcome to Jared's Science Time. I'm your host, Jared Zavala. Today's topic is absolutely electrifying. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to my assistants, the neurons. We have Olivia and Kate. Fasten your seatbelts and get ready because we are about to take a ride through the fast-paced lane of the neural highway.
Yeah, right.
First, we will be looking into what the nervous system truly is. Within the nervous systems of many organisms, there are collections of neurons called nerve nets that simply control the contraction and expansion of the gastrovascular cavity. Now, as we transition into looking at more complex organisms, we begin to see the development of what we like to call nerves.
Within humans and other complex organisms, there are two main types of nervous systems, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. The central nervous system typically consists of the brain and the spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system consists of the neurons and the rest of the organism's body, such as nerves in the arms and legs.
As mentioned, there is an insane amount of neurons in your body, but there are three main types of neurons that work hand in hand with one another.
The first type are sensory neurons, and as the name suggests, these neurons specialize in transmitting information from any external stimuli that affects the organism, such as taste or touch. This information is then sent to the brain through interneurons that analyze the sensory details that were experienced. Then, once these messages have been integrated within the organism, the interneurons produce reactions to the stimuli through motor neurons, which correspond with effector cells, muscle cells, endocrine cells, or to automatic reflexes, such as the knee-jerk reflex.
The second class of neurons are motor neurons. Unlike sensory neurons, which deal with sensory information, motor neurons are in control of muscle movement. Once the brain receives input from the sensory neurons, the signal is then transferred to the motor cortex of the brain. The signal travels down the brainstem, through the spinal cord, and then reaches the muscle fibers. Action potential then causes voluntary muscle movement. Efferent nerve fibers are the axon of the motor neurons which specifically initiate movement.
The third class of neurons are interneurons. These are designed to communicate with one another and are found throughout the brainstem and spinal cord. If we were to map the sequence of a signal transmission, it would be sensory neurons bringing sensory input to the brain, which then signals the interneurons in the spinal cord, and finally passes the info off to the motor neuron conducting movement. These three types of neurons work in conjunction with one another.
Now, we'll look into different structures and functions of the neurons that control your body.
The neuron's main parts include the nucleus, which is located within the cell body or soma of the cell. Branching from the cell body, there are two possible extensions, either dendrites, which are signal receptors for other neurons, or axons. Axons are typically longer than dendrites and are protected by a myelin sheath that offers protection and speeds up the signal transmission between neurons within the body. The axons then send the signals to the other neurons and also lead to the synapse, which is the meeting point between the axon and other dendrites. These signals are sent through neurotransmitters.
Glial cells support the structural integrity and form functioning of the neurons within the body. One of the main types of glial cells include the astrocytes, which provide further structural support for neurons and regulate extracellular concentrations of ions and neurotransmitters. Furthermore, the astrocytes develop the blood-brain barrier, which restricts the passage of certain substances from the CNS by creating tight junctions between the lining of the brain and the spinal cord. Likewise, radial glia are found during embryonic development and form tracks for newly formed neurons to migrate from to create the CNS. And finally, the oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells are glial cells that form the myelin sheath around the axons and aid in signal transmission throughout the body.
The big question is, how do neurons work in conjunction with one another to pass on an electrical signal that ultimately triggers a response from the brain? The answer lies in the exchange of sodium and potassium ions to the neuron cell membrane. The exchange of these ions builds up a chemical and electrical gradient that moves the electrical impulses across.
Membrane potential refers to the voltage across a cell's plasma membrane. For neurons specifically, the membrane potential is roughly -70 megavolts.
Resting potential is the electric potential when there is no signal passing through the neuron, or when the neuron is at rest, hence the name. The resting potential is determined by the concentration of ions across the membrane. Take humans, for example. The extracellular fluid in humans has sodium and potassium in it.
The concentration gradient of each of these ions is determined by the concentration outside and or inside. At rest, the sodium concentration is 150/15, while the potassium ion concentration is 5/150. We can see there are more potassium ions within the neuron and more sodium ions outside while at rest.
Before we can talk about how the neuron actually moves the signal across, we must discuss the specific ion channels and pumps that allow this to happen.
Gated ion channels are located on the membranes of the neurons. The opening and closing of the ion channels is triggered by stretching the membrane when a neurotransmitter binds to it, or when the membrane potential changes. In neurons, a sodium channel, potassium channel, and sodium-potassium pump can be found.
Action potential is the change in voltage created by an impulse or signal to the neuron. For action potential to begin, the stimulus must bypass the threshold, which is the certain membrane voltage that the stimulus must surpass. Depolarization is the first stage of action potential.
The signal created triggers the sodium channel located on the membrane to open, increasing the positive sodium concentration inside the neuron. The inside of the neuron is positive relative to the outside. The difference in polarity creates an electric gradient. The second stage of action potential is depolarization, which is when the positive potassium ions exit the neuron to the outside. The movement of potassium ions balances out the electric gradients caused by the influx of sodium ions in depolarization. The last stage of action potential is the refractory stage. In this stage, the sodium-potassium pumps returns the sodium and potassium ions back to where they began.
The neuron waits until another stimulus opens the sodium channel to begin depolarization again. The whole process occurs in a fast wave, moving the signal along many neurons. When the signal travels through one neuron to another, it does so through the synapse.
The synaptic cleft is the gap between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. For the signal to move across the synapse, there are ligand-gated ion channels on the postsynaptic neuron. The presynaptic neuron releases the neurotransmitter, which reaches the recept, opening the channel and allowing ions to move into the postsynaptic membrane.
Remember, ions will travel from high to low concentration. The low concentration is the postsynaptic neuron, and this entire process is called direct synaptic transmission. On the other hand, non-direct synaptic transmission involves a neurotransmitter, which once again travels across the synapse, but this time the receptor releases a second messenger into the neuron.
Indirect transmission takes longer to occur because it requires a second messenger. Some secondary messengers include cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP. These may be released when norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter, binds to the receptor. The receptor complex activates the G protein, which then turns on the adenylyl cyclase enzyme. Adenylyl cyclase converts adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, into CAMP, which then adds a phosphate group to channel proteins, allowing them to open or close.
Oh, you started. Okay. There are many types of neurotransmitters that allow synaptic transmission to occur.
Common neurotransmitters that allow this transmission include acetylcholine, biogenic amines, which include epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, amino acids, which include GABA, glycine, glutamate, and aspartate, as well as non-peptides such as endorphins. All of these differ in structure, functional class, and secretion sites.
Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter involved in learning and memory, and it also controls muscle action. Endorphins are released during exercise, excitement, and sex.
Now, for part 2, we're moving on to my favorite topic, the brain. Though the neurons send signals throughout the body, the main control center is the brain. For all vertebrates, there are 3 main parts to it. There are the forebrain, the midbrain, and then over here the hindbrain, and all of which are very important in the embryonic development of organisms. Through the embryonic process, after 5 weeks, the 3 main parts become 5 main parts, as you can see by the brain. After 5 weeks, the hindbrain is transformed to the metencephalon and the myelencephalon, which is ultimately transformed into the pons, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata after they are completely developed. Now these changes are produced within the telencephalon, which eventually develops into the cerebrum. The cerebrum rapidly develops in the first 2 to 3 months until eventually it encompasses most of the entire brain. With all of these parts of the brain, there are functions derived allowing for the survival and daily operations of the organism. The first section of the brain that we will be diving into is the brainstem, primarily consisted of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Now, the medulla oblongata is associated with automatic functions such as breathing, swallowing, and blood vessel control. Meanwhile, the pons is primarily responsible for motor control, and the midbrain is associated with sensory interpretation. Auditory and visual sensory information is sent and received through this midbrain. As mentioned, automatic actions are controlled through the entire brainstem, such as sleep and arousal. Arousal being the state of awareness. Within the center of the brainstem, the reticular formation, which is a large network of neurons, is mainly tasked to regulate sleep and arousal for the organism in which it is part of. Now, the next section mainly focuses on balance and coordination, which is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is essential in motor development through memorization of motion, such as riding a bike. The third section of the brain is the diencephalon, which is consisted of the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus, all of which are right here. Now, the hypothalamus' main function is to produce cerebral spinal fluid from the blood, while the thalamus and the hypothalamus also have a wide range of roles within the body. The thalamus helps sort out all sorts of sensory information coming from external stimuli, while the hypothalamus is essential for homeostatic regulation, such as hunger and thirst. The circadian rhythm is maintained through an animal's biological clock, and for mammals, it's a pair of structures within the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nuclei, or the SCN. Moving on to the fourth and largest section of the brain, the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum is consisted of 2 hemispheres, the right and the left side of the cerebrum. And while it might not seem like it, the right side of the cerebrum actually controls the left side of your body, while the left part of the cerebrum actually controls the right side of your body. The corpus callosum connects the 2 hemispheres together and allows for communication and coordination of movement. In each hemisphere, there is a cerebral cortex, also known as gray matter. The cerebral cortex is tasked with voluntary movement and cognitive function. It does so by receiving sensory information from the 4 lobes, the frontal, temporal, parietal, and the occipital lobe, and then issuing motor commands. To make things clear, visual information is processed by the occipital lobe. Auditory information, or sound, is processed by the temporal lobe, and somatosensory information goes to the parietal lobe. Somatosensory information includes things like touch, pain, temperature, and pressure, and olfactory information is sent to the frontal lobe. For humans, the cerebral cortex is the most complex part of the brain. All information is sent to the association areas, which process the input and then directs the cerebral cortex to generate motor commands, such as movement or even speech. Speaking of speech, the part of the brain that is in charge of language and speech composition is the Broca's area. The Broca's area is located in the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe. The Wernicke's area is in the temporal lobe, which becomes active when speech is heard, and these 2 parts work in conjunction to allow for speech to be developed and heard. Last but not least is memory and learning. Memory is separated into short-term and long-term memory. Short-term memory is stored in the frontal lobe, and it's information that has just been received recently. On the other hand, long-term memory is stored in the hippocampus, where it can be retrieved and moved back to short-term memory when necessary. Short-term memory will expire after the information has become irrelevant, and memory is involved in all sorts of processes in learning, and learning is usually done through repetition. An example of this would be a second grader completing multiplication tables in order to learn or remember rules of multiplication. Learning is a methodological procedure which will be converted into memory. One method of learning is done through long-term potential, or LTP. In LTP, the synaptic transmission is increased while the presynaptic neurons fire higher frequency action potentials with the help of glutamate neurotransmitters. Glutamate has 2 types of receptors, AMPA and NMDA. When glutamate binds to the AMPA receptors, it opens the AMPA receptor sodium and potassium to diffuse in, and this depolarizes the postsynaptic membrane and creates a higher action potential and will allow for the signal to be amplified. NMDA is similar as its receptor channel will open when glutamate is present, and the membrane has already been depolarized. Ultimately, the binding of glutamate to these receptors allows LTP to occur.
The central nervous system in mammals cannot repair itself like the peripheral nervous system, and while there are some cases where neurons are able to make different connections and recover, most of the time any injury or damage to the central nervous system causes irreversible damage.
Before discussing different diseases, let's talk about nerve cells. In order for the nerve to be able to begin to communicate with other cells, the axon must start to lengthen anywhere from a meter to a couple of micrometers towards the target cell, led by the growth cone. Along with nerve growth factors released by growth-promoting proteins in astrocytes to aid in elongation, signal molecules released by cells surrounding the axon's path create a signal transduction pathway, causing the axon to continue its indirect growth route to go either towards or away from the molecules. Once the axon reaches the target cell, it creates receptors that bind to a protein called SLIT that, along with Netrin-1, keeps the axon in place.
Contrary to prior beliefs, the brain does in fact create new neurons, even in adulthood. Thanks to Fred Gage and his colleagues, we now know that there are stem cells in adult human brains called neural progenitor cells that can transform into neurons, glia, or astrocytes. This is very important because researchers hope to be able to implant these stem cells into people to help with a damaged CNS and to recreate needed neurons or glia.
Now we will begin looking at some diseases of the nervous system. We will begin with a severe mental illness called schizophrenia, which affects about 1% of the population. Those affected by schizophrenia experience psychotic episodes in which they break from reality and may experience hallucinations, paranoid delusions, speech impairment, and lack of true emotions. While the actual cause of this illness is unknown, unidentified environmental factors influence whether or not a person may experience schizophrenia. Genetics have also been found to play a part in the onset of symptoms, and there is even a 50% concordance rate in monozygotic twins. We do know that more than one gene causes this disorder, since not every child of someone with schizophrenia also has it, but the actual gene is unknown. However, they are being researched now more than ever since the human genome has been mapped.
Medications for schizophrenia tend to interfere with receptors for the neurotransmitter dopamine, specifically ones that block the D2 receptors in the brain, since excess dopamine is thought to be the cause of schizophrenia. Other medications, called atypical antipsychotics, act more on the norepinephrine and/or serotonin receptors than D2 receptors. Some medications can have negative side effects on patients, one being a condition known as tardive dyskinesia that causes uncontrollable facial twitches, and also some blood disorders.
Another form of mental illness is depression, which includes bipolar disorder and major depressive disorder. Bipolar disorder is characterized by both depressive and manic stages. In manic stages, the individual experiences high levels of confidence, increased energy levels, irrational ideas and plans, over-talkativeness, and engages in risky behaviors. During depressive stages, the individual experiences feelings of worthlessness, lack of motivation, interest in activities, sleep problems, and can even sometimes have suicidal thoughts. Bipolar disorder affects about 1% of the total world population, and major depressive disorder affects about 5% of the population. Both disorders have a concordance rate of 50% in monozygotic twins. Stress and traumatic events in childhood can impact the onset of depressive disorders. There are several different types of medications and treatments for depression, including Prozac, lithium, electroconvulsive shock therapy, and talk therapy. Some known side effects of the medications are high blood pressure and tuberculosis.
Alzheimer's disease is characterized by memory loss, personality changes, confusion, anger, and other symptoms. The risk of being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease increases as an individual gets older, with about 10% of people aged 65 and about 35% of people aged 85 being diagnosed. This disease is difficult to diagnose due to its deterioration of the brain and neurons inside of the brain. Two ways to diagnose Alzheimer's disease post-mortem is looking for neurofibrillary tangles, which are bundles of deteriorated neurons and glial cells, and also sensile plaques, which are groups of insoluble peptides called B-beta, in the brain tissue. The plaque seems to be the main source of death of the neurons. There is currently much research on developing a treatment for Alzheimer's disease, and there is currently a chemical named Pittsburgh Compound B that may help to lower the rates of these plaques.
The final disease that we will discuss is called Parkinson's disease, which affects about 1 million people in the United States. This disease is considered a motor disorder, and its symptoms include slowed movement, muscle rigidity and shakes, poor posture, and poor balance. Patients may also experience problems with facial expressions and are often seen shuffling as they walk. This disease is progressive, and the risk of being diagnosed increases as we age, with about 1% of 65-year-olds and 5% of 85-year-olds being diagnosed. Parkinson's is caused by the death of neurons in the midbrain nucleus known as the substantia nigra. These neurons normally release dopamine from their synaptic terminals in the basal nuclei. A single cause has not yet been found. However, like the other diseases discussed, it is affected by both environmental and genetic factors.
There is no current cure for Parkinson's disease, but medications such as L-Dopa, which impacts the amount of dopamine in the brain, and treatments like brain surgery and deep brain stimulation may help. In the future, researchers hope to implement dopamine-secreting neurons into the midbrain nucleus or the basal ganglia, or use stem cells to create these neurons. Today, we covered how the neurons in your brain receive and send signals to make you tick. Then, we covered the brain itself and the many structures that allow you to process the world to the fullest of your abilities. Finally, we covered the diseases that target your body through the nervous system and the future outlook for these diseases. And that's it for today. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Jared Science Time. I have been your host, Jared Zavala. And thank you to the neurons, Olivia and Kaylee, for helping me teach you all today. Have a great day.